Let's talk about dialogue. I'm just going to highlight my dialogue here for a second. Well, first I'll give myself a character name. Let's call Jonathan the character. As you can see in most screenwriting, it'll automatically shift to dialogue right after character. You can, of course, put a parenthetical here. Generally with dialogue, we want to avoid it. We want to avoid parentheticals for the most part, because of course we want the actors instead to be determining how to say things. So you can put a parenthetical if you feel you have to give explicit instructions to the actors. I'll give you a reason shortly why we shouldn't have to do that as screenwriters of dialogue, but I'll just point out that it is possible to do. And of course, one good reason to use a parenthetical would be if the character has to be doing a thing while they're speaking. Though again, we want to typically avoid giving the actor specific directions like that, because one of your jobs as a writer and as a screenwriter in particular is to sort of build into your script space for the actor to work. So you really don't want to overwrite the script and lock that actor into everything. You want to have a sort of bit of space that the actor can use to occupy the character and to decide things like how are they going to say the line, what are they going to do while they're saying the line, so on and so forth. So there are, of course, instances where you need to dictate that as a writer for story reasons. For the most part, though, you want to have a little bit of that gap there for the actor. But at the same time, you need the character to read well. You need the character to kind of lift off the page in the sense that it needs to sort of feel like a character and feel alive, so that the actor can come in and find it and do something with it. Your dialogue has a lot of purposes in a script. And I think before we get into some of the mechanics of how to write dialogue in a script, it's worth just thinking a little bit about the specific situation of dialogue in a script and how it is unique from other things you'd write in the script. So keep in mind that a script has really 3 or 4 audiences, depending on how you want to look at it. The first audience for the script, in many respects, is the money men and women, right? And the sort of people connected to that machine that's going to put the thing into production, potentially. So when you're writing a script, your first reader, you have to always keep in your head, your first reader is a producer or a studio head, or even just a reader who's going to either push it through the slush pile towards a studio head or producer or not. Your first reader is really a person who's trying to decide, is this script worth money? Is this script worth money? That's your first reader. Now, how do they decide, is the script worth money? Well, a lot of things go into that. A lot of them are temporary market conditions you have no control over and you shouldn't be thinking too much about in the writing process, because it'll paralyze you and it'll kill your script. You'll start making decisions not to serve the story, but for marketing reasons. So I say this, I say that your first reader is trying to figure out, is the script worth money? Not because you should be thinking in terms of money, because you need to think about that person as a reader. What is going to excite a person reading the script? Just keep in mind that the first audience has a very different way of reading a script than maybe you have as a writer. Your first readers are going to do a couple really specific things. So one thing that they commonly will do is they'll look at the first pages and then look at the final pages before they decide whether or not they're going to read the script. Another thing they're going to do is they're going to skim through the dialogue. So often what people will do is skim through and read dialogue before they've actually read the other parts of the scene. So again, like your first readers are really they're sort of looking at parts of the script to figure out, should I even bother to read the script? And the dialogue is one of the things that they're going to look at first. So even if you don't have dialogue for the first 5 pages of your script, they're going to flip past those 5 pages without reading them and start reading your dialogue. Then if they like the dialogue, they'll go back and start reading the script like a normal human being. But that dialogue has a real value in the sense that it's one of the first things people are going to read, and they're going to really assess the script's value on its dialogue for a couple of reasons. Dialogue is, for this reason, one of the most important things you can write, and one of the things you really need to have a handle on as a screenwriter. You know, if you're not great with other things, but you're really good with dialogue, then you can, it goes a long way, and you can, make up for a lot of weaknesses that you have if you can write good dialogue. And vice versa. If you're really strong elsewhere, but you got bad dialogue, you got a tin ear for dialogue, it's going to be really hard. So the dialogue is of sort of paramount importance in terms of getting people interested in the script. And then, of course, once some money person has decided that they think this script is worth something, they got to really make it worth something, they got to get an actor involved. So there is a certain point in the script's life when that dialogue is going to be part of the actor deciding whether or not they want this job. Do they want to be in this movie? That's a decision that in many ways is made on the back of the dialogue. It's not just the dialogue that they're concerned about, but it is something that they're very concerned about. And an actor will often come in and take dialogue, from other. This is something that can really be disruption in the movie. If your main character doesn't have the best dialogue, and you end up getting a larger actor or a more significant actor in that role, they'll literally go through the script and find dialogue in other scenes that isn't for that character and demand that it be moved so that they get to say it. So you can cause a lot of problems in your script if you don't have, if you're not always serving the characters in the sense of like you're giving them all really good and interesting dialogue. Now, one way you kind of get around that is, you just make sure that these characters all have good dialogue, and it's not a matter of like one has better dialogue than the other per se. But also you want to really make sure the characters are speaking like themselves, and that they all have sort of unique ways of speaking. Doesn't mean that like one has to have an accent or one needs to use slang all the time or whatever, but just that they have their own personalities. They kind of distinguish from one another as characters in terms of how they are. And then therefore, they have different character traits and so on. And therefore they're sort of speaking different. Maybe they're all speaking the same language and they're all saying the same sorts of things, but they have sort of their own way of coming at it. They're using different imagery to get their point across. They got a different manner or bearing. So distinguishing the characters from one another is part of the dialogue. Attracting, an actor or a producer's interest is in many ways something that lies on the back of the dialogue, at least initially. The other thing that's really important to understand with the dialogue and what distinguishes it from other things in the script is that the dialogue is actually the only words you as the screenwriter would write that actually could relay through the production process to the audience. The actual audience for the movie never sees any of these words. They never get to hear any of these words except the dialogue and the character names and maybe the title, right? If you write the title and that stays the title through production, then that title goes on the movie. If you name the characters and their names don't change during production, then their names get relayed to the audience. Nothing else except this dialogue is going to get relayed to the audience. If you write a description of something, maybe they'll go build that thing in the way you described it. Maybe they won't. But those words never get moved from this position to that position, right? The audience never sees the description that you wrote. The audience never sees the scene hitting you wrote. The audience never sees the action that you described these characters undertaking. They'll see the character doing the thing or they won't. They'll see the picture on the wall, but they won't see your description of how the picture on the wall should look, right? The dialogue is one of the very few things that actually The words you write could be the words the audience receives. Now, it's not always that, which for a reason we'll get into in a minute. But it has sort of that importance in the sense that this is really like one of the few things you as a writer controls, at least initially, and can, kind of really shape in the final, version of this thing. If you can really write the dialogue well, chances are your dialogue is going to make it to the screen. Whereas, a lot of other things are likely to change. Dialogue can also be likely to change, especially in certain genres. So in comedy, for example, it's very likely that your dialogue is going to change if your movie is at all good. The dialogue will probably be altered by the characters, by the actors playing the characters. Ideally, you've got good comic actors who can improvise and come up with 10 different versions of something. Maybe they come up with a better joke than what you got, right? But if your joke's good enough, they'll say your joke. So dialogue has a lot of functions. It has a bunch of different audiences, right? It's not just the person who's going to watch this movie. It's also the actor who's going to play that character, or the producer who might, try to make the decision about spending money. And of course, it just needs to read well for that reason and be interesting in and of itself. But also, it has to have a distinguishment. Jonathan has to talk different from Selima. Selima has to talk differently from, Terminator the T-1000, right? We just all need, as characters, they all need to have their own ways of speaking. But that said, when we're writing dialogue, there's a few mechanical craft things that you need to keep in mind and that are consistent regardless of the precise way that somebody is speaking or putting a sentence together. One really simple thing that you have to understand as a screenwriter is that almost all your dialogue should be like, I'm just going to write something down. One thing that you really need to understand as a screenwriter is that your dialogue needs to be short. Let's just copy this for a second. Let's give, make this Tom that's speaking now. If you write more than 3 lines in a script, we are looking at lines on a page, then we really are moving into the territory of a speech. And speeches are boring to the audience. When you write dialogue that goes on this long, it is really a once in a script moment. If you do it more than once, it won't be tolerated, broadly speaking. There are always exceptions. You also have to understand that these are the words people will say. You have to spell out things exactly as they should be said. So if I am reading the time out loud and telling you the time, you write actor could say that. There's a couple of things in what I just wrote here. When you look at a script and you see something like this, you see a dialogue that goes that long, the script gets thrown in the garbage, broadly speaking. If people keep talking like this, they'll just throw it away because it's unactable. You can't have a scene where people talk that much. It just doesn't work. Now you can have it happen once in a while. If somebody gives a speech, that's fine. But how many speeches do you see in a movie? You know what I mean? Think about that. Think about how many speeches you as a person watching a movie will actually tolerate. It's very few. 1, 2, maybe 3 is pushing it, almost all your dialogue should be 3 lines or less. If you write a chunk of dialogue, almost all your dialogue should be 1 or 2 lines. 3 is kind of pushing it. 4 is pretty much your maximum limit of lines you want a person to say at once. Now, the reason for this is really simple. It's about timing. If I say something, just think for a second. I'm just going to sit here and time myself saying this first part, okay? That's 3 lines of dialogue. I'm going to stopwatch it. One thing that you really need to understand as a screenwriter is that your dialogue needs to be short. That's 5.5 seconds. Now, I know that 5.5 seconds doesn't sound like a lot, but just sit there in silence for 5.5 seconds. It feels a lot longer than it is. And on a screen, it really feels long because the other thing that kind of comes into play is what is the other character doing? So like 5.5 seconds, that's not too bad. Again, like I say, 3 lines, that's not too bad. You can get away with that. But like when you start to get into 4 or 5 lines is where you start to get really long. Let's just take this part. I'm just going to read this, okay? So now I'm reading 7 lines. Now, on a page, it doesn't look like that much text, right? Well, that's just, again, 5 seconds, not a big deal. 5.5 seconds even, kind of pushing it, but it's all right. I'm going to read what Thomas is saying there at the top here. Let's just delete this part down here. One thing you really need to understand as a screenwriter is that your dialogue needs to be short. If you write more than 3 lines in a script, we are looking at lines on a page, then we really are moving into the territory of a speech. Now I'm at 12 seconds. Now let's just sit here in silence for 12 seconds. Do you see how that's a long time to be waiting for somebody else to finish talking? Now, there's a couple things that come into play here. So one is the audience is listening to the person talk. If they go on for 12 seconds or so, let's say they're going on this long, there's a few things that start to happen. One is that you're eating up screen time. So your moving is lengthening. And they're talking a lot, right? If everyone's kind of talking like this, basically you got a movie where people talk a lot. And a movie where people talk a lot, it's a certain type of movie. And it can work, and it does work from time to time. But at the same time, you can see, of course, I hope, that mostly when we go to movies, we're not going there to watch people talk a lot, right? Television, we tolerate talking more. In the theater, we tolerate talking to an extreme degree. In the movie, we want to see something happen. And the more they're talking, the less that's happening. The other thing that comes into play here is that the other actor in the scene has to listen to them. So the other actor in the scene has to find something to do for 12 seconds. And they also have to display that they're listening. So you kind of start to get a real static scene because somebody's talking and the other person's just standing there listening. And then the other person starts talking and then the other person starts standing there listening. Like it starts to become a really static scene really fast if we have that much, talking going on. But then the other thing that kind of gets into play here is, remember, keep in mind, this is all audio. And so, especially when multiple people start to talk in this manner in a scene, the audience can't track what's being said. It's just too much stuff in a text block for the audience to really hear it and absorb it all. They just don't have like the ability fundamentally to absorb all that information. They're eating popcorn, right? It's a very different situation than the situation of the plays in a theater. It's a very different theatrical situation from that. It's a very different theatrical situation from being at home even too, right? Where at home people don't pay like laser focused attention to the television. And it's not that they're absorbing, it's not that they're more used to like absorbing dialogue. If you look really closely at television writing, what you notice is that people talk more, but also they say the same things over and over again. Because half the time the audience has just walked away and then come back, without, necessarily pausing it, or they have it kind of in the background while they're doing something else. And so most of what people say in the television situation of viewing has less and less, like there's real repetition built into it. That isn't great. It tends to be annoying to most audience members, but it's certainly, the point is that it's tolerated more. Now people are watching movies more and more at home, and more this, we get less of a distinguishment between television and the theatrical, film. At the same time, when that's happening, what you're actually seeing is that people are tolerating talking less when they watch it at home, as opposed to tolerating it more in the theater. Now, there's always exceptions. Somebody who really, has a handle on dialogue and whose dialogue we love and enjoy as audience members gets tolerated more. Quentin Tarantino and Kevin Smith get tolerated. Even someone like guy wrote Buffy. I blanked on his name because I don't like his writing at all personally, but he is a person who is considered to be a good dialogue writer. Now, I personally don't consider him to be a good dialogue writer, but many people do. He has a style of dialogue, and if you like it, you want to listen to it. For the most part, people don't want to listen to dialogue. They want something to happen. So again, one really simple practical thing you need to keep in mind when you're writing a screenplay is that you want almost all your dialogue to be 3 lines or less. So when formatted like this, it should be 3 lines or less, almost everything they're saying, hopefully 1 or 2 lines. 3 lines is okay. 4 lines is sort of pushing it. 5 lines is not, you can't do that, but you really have to be sparing. You really have to pick your moments when you're going to write that long. It just creates so many problems logistically and in terms of how they're going to have to produce and put that scene together. And what's going to happen if you start to write long like that is that when they edit the film, they'll just cut it. So they'll start editing, the shots to cut half of what the person is saying, usually. The other thing that kind of ties in here is that often when you look at the dialogue you've written, you'll typically see this situation. So often people will write things like, I don't think that you are listening to me, and it makes me angry. They'll write something like, yeah, yes, that's what I said. I don't think you're listening to me, and it makes me angry. So let's say somebody writes that in the script, okay? Here's the thing. There's something we need to be always aware of when we're writing dialogue. And that is the best dialogue has what we call subtext. What that means is we have this text, the surface text, which is the words that the actor is saying. Okay, so here's the words the actor is saying. But we also have, ideally, below what the actor is saying, what they really mean. Right? So they're saying something. They got these words that they're saying that you've written. What they mean is something kind of, a little deeper down. Now, the thing to understand about dialogue and actors, and this also goes for prose, but it's easier to see in the case of screenwriting. Of course, when we're screenwriting, it's most applicable. What actors do is they memorize lines so that they can say them without thinking, because the lines don't matter. What matters is the subtext. Actors play subtext. They memorize lines and they say them out loud, but what they're doing, like the job of the actor, is to deliver subtext. So you need to write dialogue that has subtext, because if you don't, one, the dialogue seems flat. You know, what we say flat. This dialogue here doesn't have subtext. They're saying what they mean, right? If somebody says what they mean in a script, that means they're speaking without subtext. There's not some second thing they mean when they say this. Therefore, the actor has nothing to do. So what's going to happen is the actor is either going to deliver the lines as you wrote them, with the kind of, you know, giving the meaning to the lines that you wrote into the lines, which they're currently saying. And then they're going to seem like they're bad actors. Now, they may be fine actors, but just your writing is no good. Or they may be, you know, like bad actors, but it doesn't matter whether they're good or bad because they have nothing to work with. You know, the actor needs subtext built into the line so they can deliver the subtext. The worst scenario, so either you get flat acting and, you know, these flat dialogue lines, and the scene just seems really stiff and stilted and poorly done. You know, sometimes they'll blame the actors for that when really it's your fault. But the other thing that can happen is if there's no subtext, the actors will just put subtext into it. So now the scene's out of your control because you wrote words that are angry and the actor plays them like they're not angry, plays them like they're, you know, really lusty. Now, weirdly, now that's like now a situation where you just haven't controlled the scene enough, and now the actor has had to take over the scene because the actor will recognize either intellectually or even instinctually, the actor will recognize that there's no subtext here. I have to put, like, I need to save this scene. A good actor will ruin your scene if you don't write subtext. At best, they'll, you know, a really good actor might save it. A decent actor will potentially ruin it because they're just trying to save it. And a bad actor will do what you told them to do and you'll be flat. So you need to have the subtext. What you'll see a lot of the times in a draft script, so when you write a draft of a script, you'll often see this kind of thing. You know, that's what I've said. I don't think you're listening to me and it makes me angry. This is what I see a lot in scripts. And it's not even a bad thing to do in your first draft. I wouldn't actually even say, you know, write it like this way in your first draft, but then when you're editing it, make sure you're changing it. So here, all the subtext is on the surface. We call this, sometimes you'll hear the term on the nose, like the dialogue is on the nose. You'll almost always see this example. There's two sentences. One of them is a sentence where the actor is saying something, and then directly after that, usually they're explaining the subtext of the previous sentence. And in that case, almost always, so keep in mind, note that this sentence contains this as subtext. So the subtext of yes, that's what I said, is I don't think you're listening to me and it makes me angry. You know, when I say yes, that's what I said, it sounds like I'm agreeing with you, but really I'm like arguing with you, right? Because I'm like, why do I have to repeat myself? So the fix always here is twofold. One, you just delete the second sentence. So notice that there's no less information here. In fact, if I just say it, you know, where it's clear I'm annoyed, I can even just, if I want to make it clear to the actor, I could write annoyed as the parenthetical here. Now, that's, you know, this does all everything that the other, that the longer text did. So usually when you see long dialogue chunks like that, what the writer has done is they put the subtext on the surface. It's not actually, you've got dialogue without subtext. So one fix for that, like I say, usually you've just literally in a script had two sentences and one of them can be deleted because it's the subtext of the other one. That's the easiest, simplest fix. And that gets us from like first draft to second draft here. But what would really push us past that to like a really solid third draft is if I actually like wrote some better dialogue that is a bit more unique to the character and more, but still has the same subtext. So if I went even further with this, and you make it like clearer and clearer what they mean, but like one reason I would have to write the parenthetical here is because maybe it's not clear from these words that they're annoyed. I don't want to say, I'm really annoyed with you, because then there's no subtext. I want him to say something else and seem annoyed. So maybe I have them write something, maybe I have them say something like, you sure are on top of things, right? Something where it's like, they're belittling whatever the person just said. Like, yeah, everyone knows that. If you're paying any attention, you wouldn't even have to say that, right? Whatever it is, I mean, unless you have a whole scene, it's kind of hard to see precisely what it would work. But again, here it's like a sarcastic statement. Anything that has that, where it's like, we're getting across how this character is sort of their attitude, but at the same time, there's a meaning below the surface of what they're saying that isn't apparent immediately on the surface. So the actor has something to do, the audience has something to do, they can pull the subtext out. So they're engaged, right? The audience is engaged because they're working to get the subtext out. The sentence is short, the dialogue is short, so the audience doesn't have to remember everything, and so on and so forth. Now, we can also use dialogue to deliver exposition, to get information to the audience. You want to be really sparing with that, right? Keep it short, hide it in there sneakily. It is a function of dialogue, but for the most part, the purpose of dialogue is to display what the characters' attitudes are and what they really mean, the things they aren't saying.